I want to start by slowing this news down because if you've been following the headlines, you probably think you already know what happened. Canada redirected aluminum exports. The United States faced shortages. Prices jumped. Politicians yelled. End of story. But that version leaves out the part that actually matters, the part that explains why this didn't just happen, but was almost guaranteed to happen once certain decisions were made in Washington. I've spent decades studying how trade policy collides with real industrial systems, and I can tell you this was not an accident, not a surprise, and certainly not bad luck. It was the predictable result of treating economics like a slogan instead of a system. On the surface, the administration framed this as a toughness story. Tariffs were supposed to defend American workers, revive domestic smelters, and restore some imagined industrial independence. That story sounds reassuring, especially if you're worried about deindustrialization or job loss. But reassurance is not the same thing as reality. When you look past the rhetoric and actually examine how aluminum flows through the modern economy, the entire logic collapses. The United States does not produce enough primary aluminum to meet its own needs. It hasn't for years. We rely overwhelmingly on imports, and Canada has been the single most reliable supplier integrated into North American manufacturing as tightly as any supply chain on Earth. So when tariffs were imposed on Canadian aluminum, this was not a pressure tactic against a hostile rival. It was a shock delivered straight into the heart of our own industrial ecosystem. Policymakers assumed Canada would absorb the pain, accept lower margins, and keep shipping metal south because they had no alternative. That assumption reveals a deep misunderstanding of how global markets actually work today. Capital moves, contracts shift, suppliers adapt. Canada did exactly what any rational economic actor would do when faced with political uncertainty and punitive costs. They redirected exports to buyers who were willing to pay market prices without turning trade into a geopolitical gamble. Once that happened, the consequences rippled outward with astonishing speed. American manufacturers who depend on aluminum, and that includes everything from autos to aerospace to construction materials to beverage cans, suddenly found themselves competing for a shrinking pool of supply. Prices didn't inch upward, they spiked. Delivery schedules became unreliable, and the just-in-time systems that keep modern factories running efficiently began to seize up. This wasn't theoretical damage. This was operational damage, hitting companies that operate on thin margins and tight timelines. What makes this episode so revealing is that it exposes a fantasy at the core of modern tariff politics. The fantasy is that supply chains are static, that allies have no options, and that political power can override economic structure without consequences. But supply chains are dynamic networks, not command hierarchies. When you inject volatility into them, you don't get obedience, you get reconfiguration. Canada didn't punish the United States out of spite. They simply reduced their exposure to an unreliable partner and sought stability elsewhere. There's another layer to this that rarely makes it into the conversation. Even for the aluminum that continued to reach the U.S. market, prices rose beyond the tariff itself. Businesses price in risk. When governments demonstrate a willingness to change rules abruptly, suppliers add an uncertainty premium. That premium doesn't show up in press conferences, but it shows up on invoices. And it doesn't get paid by politicians. It gets paid by manufacturers and then by consumers quietly and relentlessly. This is where the story stops being abstract and starts touching everyday life. When aluminum costs jump, companies face three options: cut labor, cut investment, raise prices. Most do all three. That means delayed expansions, shelved hiring plans, higher prices on cars, appliances, building materials, even food packaging. This is how a policy sold as worker protection becomes a machine for spreading economic insecurity. And all of this was foreseeable. None of it required hindsight. It required only a basic understanding of interdependence and incentives, something economists have been warning about for decades. This moment didn't reveal Canadian power. It revealed American vulnerability, and not because the country is weak, but because policy was built on denial rather than arithmetic. That's the deeper story hiding behind the aluminum headlines. And if we don't confront it honestly, we're going to keep repeating the same mistakes under different slogans. What troubles me even more is what happened once the price shock settled in and the political noise moved on, because this is the phase that almost never gets discussed, and it's where the real transfer of wealth takes place. When tariffs raise the price of imported aluminum, domestic producers don't heroically hold the line out of national loyalty. They do what markets tell them to do. They raise their prices to just below the new tariff-inflated ceiling. Even companies that buy entirely American aluminum end up paying more, not because the government needs the revenue, but because the market has been artificially reset upward. That difference matters. In theory, tariffs are often sold as a way to raise public revenue while encouraging domestic production. In practice, much of the extra money never touches the public treasury. It becomes a windfall for a small number of upstream producers. This is income generated not through better technology, higher productivity, or innovation, but through political intervention. And it's important to understand how small this group really is. We're talking about a handful of smelters benefiting from price protection, while tens of thousands of downstream firms absorb higher costs. The imbalance is staggering. Those downstream firms are where most industrial jobs actually exist. They are the companies stamping parts, assembling vehicles, fabricating structures, and packaging food. They employ millions of people. When their input costs surge, the pressure doesn't disappear. It flows downhill, wages stagnate, overtime gets cut, investment plans are delayed, prices rise, communities feel it slowly, then all at once. And yet the policy conversation remains fixated on whether a few facilities upstream can stay profitable behind a tariff wall. This is a classic case of concentrated benefits and dispersed costs. The winners are few, organized, well-funded, and highly motivated. The losers are many, fragmented, and rarely heard as a unified voice. A soda can costing a few cents more doesn't trigger public outrage. A car costing hundreds more doesn't always get traced back to trade policy. The political system responds to intensity, not scale. That's how policies that quietly drain the broader economy manage to survive long after their damage becomes obvious to anyone paying attention. National security was used as the justification, and I want to pause on that because it matters. Invoking security allows executives to bypass normal trade rules and democratic scrutiny. But the idea that Canadian aluminum represents a security threat collapses the moment you examine it seriously. Canada is not an adversary. It is a deeply integrated ally. We share defense production, military coordination, and strategic planning. Treating that relationship as a vulnerability rather than a strength doesn't make us safer. It makes us more isolated and more brittle. While American manufacturers struggled with rising costs and uncertain supply, competitors abroad were buying aluminum at stable global prices, often the very same Canadian aluminum redirected away from the U.S. market. That gave them a built-in cost advantage. When a German or Asian manufacturer can source inputs more cheaply and reliably than an American firm, the outcome is predictable. Contracts shift, market share erodes, investment follows stability. This is not ideology, it is arithmetic. What emerges over time is not a dramatic collapse, but a slow hollowing out. Companies choose to expand elsewhere. New plants get built outside the United States. Supply chains reorient quietly. By the time closures make the news, the damage has already been done. And the cruel irony is that this erosion hits precisely the kind of manufacturing jobs politicians claim to be defending. There's also a deeper trust issue at play. Business depends on predictability. When governments demonstrate that long-standing agreements can be overturned abruptly, firms respond by shortening their planning horizons. They hold more inventory. They diversify away from dependence on any one market. They treat political risk as a permanent cost. Even if tariffs are lifted tomorrow, the memory of the shock remains embedded in corporate strategy. Volatility lingers long after the policy that caused it is reversed. This is why I keep emphasizing that what we saw wasn't strength, it was fragility exposed. True resilience comes from reliable partnerships and diversified supply networks. It comes from being the customer and partner others want to work with. When we replaced cooperation with coercion, we didn't become independent. We made ourselves more vulnerable to exactly the kinds of disruptions we claim to fear. And that's not a coincidence. It's the logical outcome of confusing political theater with economic reality. At this point, I want you to notice something important about how this story was framed in the media, because the framing itself tells us a lot about how economic power operates. Most coverage focused on personalities, on who said what, on who looked angry or defiant. There were breathless panels about trade wars and national pride, about winners and losers in a geopolitical chess match. What was largely missing was a serious discussion of structure. Almost no one asked the simplest question of all: who pays when input costs rise across an integrated economy? When prices go up quietly and incrementally, responsibility becomes invisible. There is no single villain you can point to when a refrigerator costs more or a construction bid comes in higher than expected. The link between trade policy and everyday prices is deliberately obscured, not always by conspiracy, but by convenience. Structural explanations don't fit neatly into sound bites. They don't generate outrage clicks. So instead of asking why costs are rising systemically, we're encouraged to argue about tone, patriotism, and blame. This distraction benefits the same groups that benefited financially. While downstream manufacturers struggled to stay afloat, upstream producers enjoyed protected margins. They didn't suddenly become more efficient. They didn't revolutionize their technology. They simply operated under a politically imposed price floor. And when that kind of protection arrives, companies behave rationally. They don't gamble billions on long-term modernization when they know the policy could vanish after the next election. They extract value while the extraction is possible. This is why the promised manufacturing renaissance never arrives. Tariffs are a poor substitute for industrial strategy. If the real goal were self-sufficiency, the policy would look entirely different. It would involve long-term investment, coordination, and modernization. Instead, what we got was a short-term price shock that redistributed wealth upward while weakening the base of the industrial pyramid. The policy rewarded ownership, not production. It protected balance sheets, not workers. Now think about how this plays out inside an ordinary factory. Imagine a mid-sized manufacturer that uses aluminum components. The company is already under pressure from global competition. Margins are tight. They're trying to invest in new equipment, keep wages competitive, and hold on to skilled workers. Then input costs spike and supply becomes uncertain. Suddenly, every plan becomes risky. Do you expand when you don't know if materials will arrive? Do you hire when you can't predict costs 6 months out? Rational caution takes over, investment freezes, growth stalls. Over time, that caution becomes permanent. Firms adapt not by becoming more productive at home, but by reducing exposure. They source from abroad. They relocate certain processes. They restructure supply chains in ways that reduce dependence on U.S.-based production. These decisions aren't ideological. They're defensive. And once they're made, they're hard to reverse. A factory built elsewhere doesn't magically return because a tariff was repealed. What we're really seeing here is a lesson about power and incentives. Markets don't respond to speeches. They respond to risk. When the U.S. government demonstrated that trade rules could be weaponized unpredictably, it told the world something fundamental about itself. It said that access to the American market now comes with political volatility, and volatility is costly. It's something firms will pay to avoid if they have alternatives. This is the part of the story that should worry us most, not because of Canada's decision, which was entirely rational, but because of what our own response revealed. We treated interdependence as weakness instead of strength. We mistook leverage for control, and in doing so, we undermined the very industrial base we claim to be defending. That's not bad messaging. That's a structural failure, and until we confront it honestly, we're going to keep watching the same cycle repeat under different banners. Let me take this one step deeper, because the aluminum episode isn't really about aluminum at all. It's about how power is exercised in an economy where ownership and lobbying carry more weight than productive capacity. When you trace the flow of money through this system, a very clear pattern emerges. Policies are designed in ways that look national on the surface, but functionally protect narrow private interests underneath. The public language is about workers and security. The private outcome is about margins and market power. This is where we have to talk honestly about lobbying and access. Upstream industries like primary aluminum are highly concentrated. They have clear incentives, a small number of firms, and the resources to shape policy. Downstream industries are fragmented. Thousands of companies, millions of workers, no single unified voice. That asymmetry matters. When decisions are made in Washington, the loudest, most organized interests tend to dominate the conversation. The result is policy that looks muscular but is structurally regressive. And then there's the national security argument, which deserves scrutiny because it keeps getting recycled. The logic goes like this. If we don't produce something domestically, we're vulnerable. But vulnerability depends on context. Depending on a hostile power is risky. Depending on a trusted ally with shared institutions and deep integration is not the same thing. In fact, it's often safer. When supply chains cross friendly borders, incentives align, stability increases, redundancy grows. We had that system. We dismantled it in the name of toughness. What makes this especially damaging is that it burns institutional capital. Trust, once lost, is expensive to rebuild. Canadian producers learned that contracts with U.S. buyers could suddenly become political liabilities. European and Asian buyers learned that Canada was a more predictable partner. Over time, that reputational shift hardens. The market remembers. And when markets remember, they adjust behavior permanently, not temporarily. Meanwhile, American workers are left navigating a more volatile environment, not because they lack skill or productivity, but because the ground beneath them keeps shifting. When supply chains destabilize, workers bear the adjustment costs. Layoffs happen faster than expansions. Wage pressure flows downward, not upward. Communities absorb shocks long before balance sheets do. This is how abstract policy decisions translate into real anxiety at the kitchen table. I also want to point out something subtle but important. By driving up domestic prices, tariffs act like a hidden tax. They don't show up on a paycheck. They show up at the checkout counter. And because everyone needs goods made with aluminum, the burden is broadly distributed, but the benefits are narrowly captured. This is why inequality deepens even when policies are sold as populist. The structure of the transfer matters more than the slogan attached to it. At the same time, our competitors quietly benefited. Lower input costs abroad meant better pricing power in global markets. That advantage compounds over time. A firm that wins contracts today builds capacity, experience, and scale for tomorrow. Meanwhile, American firms face higher costs and greater uncertainty. That gap doesn't close on its own. It widens. This is why I keep returning to the idea that this wasn't a mistake in execution. It was a mistake in thinking. A worldview that sees trade as dominance rather than cooperation will keep producing these outcomes. You can change the target country. You can change the rhetoric. But if the underlying logic remains the same, the results will too. And unless we're willing to rethink that logic, we're going to keep confusing economic self-harm with strength and paying for it in ways that never quite make the evening news. By now, you can probably see the larger pattern forming, and it's not limited to aluminum or even trade policy. This is about how modern capitalism resolves conflicts between concentrated power and diffuse public interest. When the two collide, power almost always wins quietly, not through conspiracy, but through structure. The system rewards those who can organize, lobby, and frame their private gains as public necessity. Everyone else absorbs the costs in small, scattered increments that rarely feel dramatic enough to provoke a collective response. What makes this especially corrosive is the way it reshapes expectations. Workers are told that instability is normal, that volatility is inevitable, that uncertainty is just the price of living in a competitive world. But notice who is insulated from that uncertainty and who is exposed to it. Owners and executives benefit from price protection and policy shields. Workers and small businesses are asked to be flexible, resilient, and patient. Risk is socialized downward. Reward is privatized upward. Over time, this erodes not just incomes, but confidence. People stop believing that policy is meant to serve them. They start seeing it as something distant, erratic, and unresponsive. And that perception isn't irrational. When economic decisions are made without regard to how real systems function, trust breaks down. People feel like the economy is happening to them rather than for them. That sense of powerlessness is fertile ground for anger, misinformation, and division. There's also a generational dimension here that rarely gets discussed. Younger workers entering manufacturing or skilled trades are stepping into an environment defined by unpredictability. Instead of long-term planning and steady investment, they see stop-start cycles driven by political swings. That makes it harder to commit to careers, harder to build communities, harder to imagine stability. An economy that can't offer predictability struggles to sustain loyalty, and loyalty is what once anchored industrial regions. And here's the bitter irony. The policies sold as restoring sovereignty end up reducing it. When domestic industries become dependent on protection rather than competitiveness, they lose leverage. They stop pushing for modernization. They stop innovating aggressively. They rely on political favor instead of technical excellence. Meanwhile, firms operating in more stable environments build real strength. They compete on cost, quality, and reliability. That's what sovereignty actually looks like in an interconnected world. We also need to talk about how quickly emergency logic becomes routine. Once national security is invoked to justify economic intervention, it becomes a shortcut. Debate narrows, oversight weakens, decisions concentrate in fewer hands. That's dangerous not only for trade policy, but for democracy itself. Economic choices that shape millions of lives should not be made through exceptional powers as a matter of habit. None of this means markets should be unregulated or that governments have no role. It means the role has to be grounded in reality rather than nostalgia. Industrial policy works when it's strategic, transparent, and long-term. It fails when it's reactive, symbolic, and captured by narrow interests. The aluminum episode shows us exactly what failure looks like in practice. If we don't learn from it, we'll see the same script play out again. Different sector, different country, same logic, same result, higher prices, weaker industry, more insecurity, and the same puzzled question afterward. Why does it feel like we keep losing even when we're told we're winning?